Just out of curiosity, how many of you are on the Historic Benton County Vintage Bentonville sites Facebook pages? Not very many. Okay. One of the things, and this is kind of why I'm known as a historian, is we host two Facebook pages. One's called Historic Benton County, one's called Vintage Bentonville. We post pictures, old pictures, almost on a daily basis on both sites. And we also host an VintageBentonville.com online museum, which has over 500 topics about local history if you want to go visit it. I have little cards up here if you want to grab one, go home, check out the Facebook page. Bella Vista things we usually put with the Vintage Bentonville. We kind of run both of those two communities together. So if you want to see some old pictures of Bella Vista, feel free to get on that site and under Vintage Bentonville. Also, I do a monthly newspaper article in the local paper, and it will be on local history also. Today we're going to talk about Bentonville and the Civil War. And Bentonville was before the Civil War was a pretty big going place. But when the Civil War came, that ceased to happen. The Confederate soldiers had moved clear up into Missouri, and they got pushed back by the Union Army. And at a little place called Dugan's Farm, about a mile north of Avoca, the Confederates took a stand, and they put a stop to the Union advancement at that point in time. That kind of became the beginning of kind of a conflict in here. Now there was no major conflicts in Bentonville during the Civil War, but there were a lot of casual things, and we only know of one facility in Bentonville. But on February 18th, 1862, there was a Union force that came down what we now would consider Old Wire Road. And at the junction where the road comes into Bentonville, they ran into a group of unmounted Confederate soldiers. And they caught the Confederate soldiers by surprise. And there's kind of a question whether it was a skirmish or not at that point in time. But more or less what ended up happening was they took all the bridles of the horses, the Union forces did, and all the saddles from the horses. Pretty much leaving the horses worthless to the Confederate soldiers until they could get bridles, and saddles would have been very hard to come by during that period of time. At that point in time, they turned west towards Bentonville, and about 12 o'clock noon, they came roaring into the city of Bentonville. Now, there wasn't any major Confederate forces in Bentonville at that point in time. What they did catch was a group of Confederate soldiers, just 32 of them, actually cleaning up after forces had been there. And they did capture a few things. They captured some equipment and some supplies. They acquired 36 horses and a quartermaster's paperwork and Confederate money. And I got a question for you. How many people here realize that the courthouse in Bentonville used to sit in the middle of the Bentonville Square? 2. The courthouse, the second courthouse in Bentonville, was built right in the middle of the Bentonville Square. And if you ever find a brick that says 1849 on it, you probably found a brick from that courthouse. It was a 50 by 50 structure, 2-story, and to my knowledge, there are no actual pictures of that building today. Now, what they did when they didn't take any captives of the soldiers in Bentonville, not that I'm aware of, but I'm sure they took everything that was there that they could take. Then they gathered up all the men other than the Confederate soldiers, which amounted to about 60 men, and they forced them to take an allegiance to the Union cause. And then by 7:30, they left the city. Now, what happened after that drastically changed the face of Bentonville at that point in time. Apparently, one soldier decided to return the town. Whether he was authorized to do this or not, we do not know. But he returned to fill up his canteen with whiskey, which was a very bad mistake on his part. What happened was when he entered the town, either a Confederate soldier or a Confederate sympathizer put 2 bullets in his head. And then they hit his body. Any idea where they hit his body? They hit his body in a local house, right? Well, that was fine until his buddies started coming looking for him. And the next day they sent out a group of soldiers to try finding where this soldier had disappeared to. Well, they found his body in the outhouse. And they proceeded to start burning Bentonville. Now they burnt down 36 buildings in Bentonville. And I'm not keeping up with this slideshow. They burnt down 36 buildings in Bentonville. And then the commander at Sugar Creek saw the smoke raising in the far distance. And he sent a group of men to tell the soldiers who were doing the burning to stop. Now, I did this speech here about 4 years ago to the Civil War Roundtable, and at that point in time somebody said, well, nothing ever happened to the group that did the burning. Well, this is actually a document that was done about a month after that they burnt Bentonville, and the person who was in charge of that group of men actually was court-martialed and kicked out of the army. Now, was there any retribution other than that? No. He was just kicked out of the army. There was no recourse for the people who had their houses burned. But this was kind of how the war continued on. Now, there wasn't any major conflicts till about a month later. What happened was the Confederate soldiers actually went down into the Boston Mountains for a while. There had been a camp of Confederate soldiers during that winter months in Cross Hollows, and all those forces moved down into the Boston Mountain area. The Union soldiers pretty much scattered out all over northwest Arkansas in separate camps located all over the place because you had to scavenge for food at that point in time. You had to find enough food for all the forces, so if they divided up the forces, they could hopefully find enough food to keep their troops fed. And of course, there was a lot of people who lost their cattle and sheep and everything else during this period of time by the soldiers taking their livestock and feed and stuff to feed themselves. The next major conflict we had was March 6th, 1862. It was a point in time they knew the Confederate Army was moving back this direction. And on that morning in the city of Bentonville, General Asbooth, who is shown here, he was a Hungarian officer, and General Osterhaus, if I'm saying it wrong, correct me.
No, you're right.
And this is a picture of Asbooth. We were trying to figure out if there was a name for this type of mustache and beard. This man was Hungarian, and his troops in Osterhaus, they came through Bentonville, and General Sigel, who's well known during the Civil War, he was the I forget what you call it. the person at the end of the procession, the person to back up all the troops to make sure that the rear guard. And in Bentonville, he had 600 men and 6 light artillery guns. And that morning, he had spent the night, I assume, in the hotel there in Bentonville, which actually stayed there until 1909, the Eagle House Hotel. And he had sat down that morning for breakfast. Now, the other troops had already passed through the town, and he was going to get a good breakfast before he headed out. So he got, a slice of ham put on his plate, and all of a sudden he got the word that Confederate soldiers were entering the town en masse. And their goal was to capture Sigel before he could rejoin the rest of the forces. So it said he ran out of the hotel with a piece of ham, got on his horse, and filed a retreat. And they retreated from the town about 2 miles. There was General McIntosh took 3,000 cavalrymen. Now, you got to remember, Sigel only had 600 guys, but they took 3,000 cavalry and sent them around north to try coming around and sealing off Sigel before he could rejoin the rest of the forces and capturing his forces. Well, the problem is they went 3 miles too far. And they had to backtrack and try getting in between Sigel and the other forces, and by that time it was too late to do that. It was overheard that Sigel had some problems in Wilson Creek also, where because he was not doing things correctly, he unnecessarily got some people killed. And see, Sigel was overheard, and sometimes you don't know whether this is folklore or actual fact. But somebody said they overheard Sigel saying, "Damn, I'm caught here worse than I was in Wilson's Creek, and all because I tried to have a good breakfast." He kept his artillery shooting as much as possible, but he flanked his horses that would pull the cannons by his own men to make sure the horses didn't get hit. I guess, I don't know, maybe his horses were more valuable to him than his soldiers were, but of course, and there was a lot of bullets flying at that point in time, but to make sure he can get his artillery out of there when he needed to, that's what he did. Just about the time Sigel's forces were about ready to get captured, they heard what was going on in Sugar Creek. And they sent 2 divisions of soldiers to fight off the group that was coming. Like I said, they came just in time. Some Union soldiers had been caught, and they ran into the other group of Union soldiers and rejoined them. So it was all kind of just a massive amount of chaos at that point in time. But after the 2 divisions of Union soldiers joined Sigel's group, they went ahead and there was a firefight there with cannons and guns until nightfall. And then both of the forces went back their own separate directions for the night. In that skirmish, there was 25 Confederate soldiers killed or wounded, and they estimate that there was 30 soldiers on the Union side that were killed or wounded. Now, Bentonville suffered majorly during the Civil War. Forces from both sides occupied the town. And there would be war crimes today, war crime tribunals everywhere if they had that back in that day. As soldiers passed through town, if they found a house unoccupied, they would figure it would be a sympathizer to the other side. And they would go ahead and they would burn those houses. So if an occupied house was there when the Union soldiers came through, they'd burn those houses. Then if the Confederates were in the area, came through that area, and there was unoccupied houses while they were in the area, they'd burn those houses. So you can kind of imagine what happened to Bentonville over this time. Now, the courthouse that was in the middle of the square was burnt. 2 churches were burnt. The Masonic Lodge was burnt. And there's some question as far as who they were burnt by. Some people said they were burned by Union forces. Some people said that they were burned by Confederate forces. If I had to, from what I've read, if I had to guess, I think the people of the town themselves burned those buildings to keep the Union forces from being able to use them. Excuse me. During this time, you also had bushwhackers and bandits that would come through, and they would just take what they want. They would kill randomly. I'm sure you've heard of Simon Sager over in Siloam Springs. He was just shot for no reason in the head. So this was it was just kind of an outlaw state at the point in time during the Civil War. And soldiers more or less took what they wanted. They also had a rule, if you were camping here, the officers gave orders, they had split rail fences. And the officers gave orders that you could take the top rail of a split rail fence, but you couldn't take the ones below it. So they'd take the top rail, they cut it up for wood, they'd make their fire and whatever. And then what happens is, the next one up all of a sudden becomes the top rail. So these fences over a period of time disappeared for firewood. We also have a story of a local pastor who had taken some grain to go like 3 miles to a mill. He didn't come back, and he was later found dead. Like I said, I only am aware of one person who died in Bentonville during this time, but I bet you there was many, many more who there's no records of, that were just killed by bushwhackers and bandits. And a lot of times the men would hide, and if you had to bury somebody, the ladies would be responsible for taking and burying the bodies. Because if the men got caught out in the light and a band came through, they would be killed. And by the end of the war, stuff became very scarce. Now, if you know what the value of stuff was back then, I mean, you'd get paid less than $1 for a day's wages. Back then, at the end of the war, a barrel of flour would cost $300. Shoes would cost $150. Coffee for a pound would cost $50. Now, this may have been also Confederate currency, which devaluated over the process of the war as it didn't look like the South was going to win. Before 1860, before the war started, Bentonville was said to have a population of about 500. Of course, you can imagine during the war, a lot of people moved south. As a matter of fact, they took the county records out of the county courthouse at that time, and they took them down to Texas and they buried them. Now, I guess there was a little bit of water damage when they dug them back up, but they still have the records after the Civil War to a certain extent. There was also a place, 2 miles west of Bentonville. It's called Shoemaker's Cave. And during the war, if you got caught making shoes for the Confederate Army, you'd be killed. You'd be hanged. That's all there was to it, for making shoes. So if you're going to make shoes for the Confederate, to help support the Confederate cause at that point in time, you had to find a place where you could really hide out. And I'm not sure, the only cave I can think about that way is the Civil War cave. And I don't know if that's the cave they're talking about, but somebody else had indicated there might be a different one. And they went ahead, that you couldn't see how to get in there. They could work easily without being seen. And they worked without fear, going ahead and making Confederate shoes. So there was a business going on helping the Confederate forces at that point in time. And even after the Civil War, Bentonville was well known for being an area where there had been a lot of conflict. As a matter of fact, there was many blue and gray reunions here, many more Confederate reunions right up until the point in time where they put the Confederate statue on the Bentonville Square. Before the war, this area was a very anti-secession area. There was very few slaves in this area. Not to say we didn't have slaves, but even some of the northern states had slaves, but we had very few. When they did the delegations to whether to secede or not, the first time Arkansas voted not to secede from the Union. Northwest Arkansas was a driving force in the reason we did not secede from the Union. The Delta and the southern part of the state were for secession. The northern part of the state, this part of the state, was against secession. And it wasn't until the attack on Fort Sumter that Arkansas actually got involved with the Civil War. Now, I've got a couple things. I think I ran a lot shorter than I thought I would. I've got some things here that this is the court-martial paperwork for the person who was responsible for burning Bentonville.
You want the one second?
Sure. Feel free to come up and look at this. And I told you about Sigel. Sigel was a very well-known general. He was German. Just like Asbuth was Hungarian. Sigel's forces, a lot of them were German, if I'm correct. And this is Sigel's death card. This is something they would do clear back in the day. They put out death cards. Now, the one interesting thing about Sigel's death card is that it's in German. The one other thing I forgot to say is that Sigel made a return trip back here 25 years after the Civil War. He stopped in the Eagle Hotel where he was not allowed to finish his breakfast. And he ordered the same thing. He stayed in the same room he stayed at during the Civil War. He went to the same table he sat at when the Confederate forces ran him out of the area. And he asked the waitress to allow him to finish his breakfast this time. And she said, "What do you mean, sir? We wouldn't run anybody out of town." And he said that on March 1862, same table, same breakfast, they ran me out of town. Like I said, if you are interested in finding out some things about the Facebook pages and the online museum, there's cards up here. You all have any questions? Yes.
How much was left? How many structures were still standing?
Sorry, I look at my notes and I skimmed over some stuff. When everything was said and done with Bentonville, and I told you the first round they burned 32 or 36 buildings. What was left at the end of the Civil War was 12 structures. That's all that was left in Bentonville.
That's not including houses.
That's including houses. I've got a count of 11 here. I don't know what the 12th one was, but the Eagle Hotel was still standing. There was 2 stores that were actually left standing at the end of the war, and 8 residential houses were left. And that was all that was left of Bentonville at the end of the Civil War. So can you imagine a town of 500 people being taken down to just 12 structures? Any other questions? Yes?
How involved was Fayetteville in the war?
One thing I'll tell you, I'm a Benton County historian. Yeah, there are people here who would know the answer to that question, but my expertise is Benton County.
Fayetteville was back and forth between Confederate and Union. In fact, the headquarters house, and if you want to visit that in Fayetteville, gives you a good story about the skirmishes and that were there. And Dan Hoffbauer, who has done some nice prints, an local artist who started painting after a 35-year hiatus, he's got a couple down there and
The store now.
yeah, they're on the store now.
In our gift
We
shop.
got the one from the Battle of Fayetteville? We don't have that one, okay. Anyway, he has painted one for the Battle of Fayetteville, and it wasn't a big battle. We're talking about 1,100 troops on either side, so not major, but it was back and forth in Fayetteville, and they did see a lot more activity. But it's just like up here, it was ravaged as far as the crops and the farm animals, etc. So it took a big hit, as most of northwest Arkansas did.
One other interesting fact was in Bentonville there was 16 different encampments of soldiers during the Civil War.
Basically, Washington and Benton counties have become a vacant no man's land. That's why you see the huge influx of individuals right after the war that really were the beginning of what we know today as our community, Bella Vista. This land was basically vacant when the war ended in 1865. As Randy said, it was basically very bitterly divided, with men serving on both sides.
Also, the Union forces in the area had like commune communities that they would go to, and it would all the Union people, since this was a highly Confederate area, all these Union people would go to this one area and farm, and as a group, they could protect themselves better.
Colonies, they were called.
Yes, sir.
So Randy, did when Siegel returned to the hotel, so the town got reestablished during the Reconstruction, or did it take?
It was slow.
20 years?
It was slow. I don't think they rebuilt the courthouse till the 1870s,
Okay.
and
Sam Walton did not have anything to do with it.
But Reconstruction was very slow because there wasn't a whole lot of money here. The money they did have was Confederate money. When the war was over with, they had to reestablish themselves, earn back the regular dollars that you would see today. So it took them a while to get back on their feet after the war.
So late 19th century then, probably.
Yeah.
Okay.
Now, one of their big cash crops, even before and after the Civil War in this area, was tobacco. We had tobacco barns all over, and some of the Civil War accounts recounted the soldiers just going into these tobacco barns and just helping themselves with whatever they want. And they said, we had as good a tobacco as Virginia did at that point in time. Chuck?
I just want to mention about Fayetteville, there is a reenactment. I think it's on April 15th, and it's the Battle of Fayetteville. They have it every year. And I'm going to put a plug in for the Civil War Roundtable, too, because Jim Spillers will be on artillery there. And so they will be firing cannon and doing the whole thing. And he is our guest speaker in June, I think, and he'll be doing band instruments of the Civil War. So we don't just talk about battles. We talk about all kinds of different aspects of the Civil War.
Okay, have you found out that some of the families were divided, brothers against brothers, in this area as much as other times, other areas like this?
There are several stories that you can read where 2 or 3 or 4 of the kids would go one direction and 2 of the kids would go the other. Most likely, most of them went with the Confederates, some went with the Unions, but some, yes, there are accounts of several families having been split up, some going one way, some going the other.
If you will visit many of our cemeteries in our area, you will find both Union and Confederate markers in those cemeteries, which is highly unusual.
So any other questions?